The day I broke ground on the back lot of my property, not a single soul in the neighborhood stopped to ask why. They just stared. Some peeked through their kitchen blinds, others slowed their golf carts as they passed, casting long sideways glances like I was burying something illegal. But I wasn't hiding a thing. In fact, what I was doing couldn't have been more out in the open. I was planning food. It started with turnips and potatoes. Then came green beans, collards, tomatoes, and a mix of medicinal herbs I'd learned to cultivate back during my last deployment overseas. The soil was surprisingly fertile once you got past the first layer of suburban clay. I brought in compost from a local farm, tested the pH levels myself, and mapped it all out with military precision rows aligned to maximize sunlight, water retention trenches at the ready. I wasn't playing farmer. I was preparing. This land had been in my family since the 1950s. It wasn't much, just under 3 acres, nestled at the edge of the newly developed Fair Hollow Estates, a neighborhood that bloomed out of nowhere in just 4 years. What once was rolling pine and hickory became tidy cul-de-sacs and faux brick facades. When they built around me, I didn't object. I figured the world needed places to live. What I didn't realize was that they'd try to erase everything I had in the process. The HOA called itself the Fair Hollow Community Board. Sounded harmless. But it didn't take long for them to live up to the worst HOA cliches, measuring grass blades, issuing citations for mailbox color deviation, and enforcing a tone of artificial civility that felt more like control than community. At first, I thought they'd ignore my field. After all, it wasn't visible from the road unless you really tried. I kept the perimeter trimmed, planted wildflowers along the fence line, even made sure the rows looked clean and symmetrical. But the board noticed, or rather Karen did. Her real name was Melissa Whitley, but everyone in the neighborhood quietly and consistently called her Karen. The type who always had her phone camera ready, and her lips drawn tight like the wind had permanently chapped them. She was president of the HOA, a title she wielded like a sword at ribbon cuttings and lawn parties. She showed up at my door the second week of May with a clipboard in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other. "Mr. Callahan," she said, looking over my shoulder like she expected to see chickens roaming free. "We've received a few concerns about your yard." I didn't flinch. "It's not my yard. It's my land. That's a food plot." She smiled, the tight kind that doesn't touch the eyes. "We understand your enthusiasm for sustainability, but agricultural activity isn't permitted in Fair Hollow." "I'm not part of Fair Hollow," I said. "Your development stops 50 feet before my property line." "Yes, but your home does appear on our community maps, and the guidelines apply to all visible properties." There it was, that HOA logic. I told her politely to leave and reminded her of the zoning laws I'd already researched. Rural agricultural use was still protected under the county charter. But her visit wasn't about the law. It was about control. And something about a man growing his own food quietly without HOA approval, it rattled them. That was the first warning. 3 days later came a letter taped to my door. Then another, this time certified. They cited unsightly structures and excessive yard activity. I took photos, filed them in a folder labeled HOA Nonsense. My neighbors, most of them younger couples or recent retirees, started keeping their distance. One guy, Mitch, I think his name was, whispered to me at the mailbox, "I think what you're doing's great, man. They're just uptight." He looked over his shoulder like he was committing treason. But I didn't stop. If anything, I doubled down. I started adding more crops, set up a small greenhouse I bought secondhand from a nearby nursery. I installed drip irrigation using rain barrels. I even constructed a root cellar beneath my shed, not because I was paranoid, but because I'd seen what happens when supply chains snap like dry twigs. I was stationed in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. I watched grandmothers wait 10 hours for a jug of water. I saw how fast people can turn when hunger sets in. I knew the signs. The world didn't have to end in flames for people to lose access to food, it only had to hiccup. By mid-June, my plot was producing more than I could eat. I started donating excess to the local pantry: collards, zucchini, okra. One woman cried when I handed her a full bag. She hadn't had fresh produce in weeks. That kept me going more than anything else. Karen came back in late July, This time, she brought a landscaper, her HOA treasurer, and what looked like a private security officer with a badge that meant nothing. She didn't speak, just pointed. The landscaper took photos. The treasurer jotted things down on a yellow pad. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked. "Documenting violations," the security guy said. "For enforcement. Of what law? Community standards." I laughed. I probably shouldn't have, but it all felt like a bad sitcom. I wasn't afraid of them yet. Later that night, I walked through the field under a full moon. The corn leaves rustled softly in the wind. My dog Scout trotted beside me, nose to the dirt. I thought about pulling out my old military trunk and digging up the folder labeled contingency plans, but I didn't, not yet. I still believed logic would win, that people would see the value in self-sufficiency, that maybe, just maybe when things got rough, they'd remember who kept growing while everyone else was posting pictures of brunch. I was wrong. It started with the yellow slips. At first, they were tucked gently into the crevice of my front door, HOA friendly reminders printed in cursive font with passive-aggressive cheerfulness. The first one claimed my irrigation barrels violated visual uniformity standards. The second noted that my greenhouse caused light reflection inconsistent with residential harmony. The third accused me of auditory disruption due to the sound of my compost tumbler. That one made me laugh. I pinned them to my fridge like war trophies. I wasn't trying to be defiant. But when you've spent years in uniform stationed in places where survival depended on cooperation and resourcefulness, it's hard to take seriously a committee obsessed with mulch color and decorative gnomes. Still, the notices kept coming. Then came the emails, polite but clipped. They usually started with "Dear Resident," despite the fact that every single one of them knew my name. HOA policy, I suppose. They escalated in tone, with each message trading the smiley euphemisms for citations and veiled threats about compliance hearings and remediation schedules. One morning, I walked out to find a laminated sign staked at the end of my driveway. It read, "This property is under review for non-compliance." The print was bold all caps, the kind you'd expect on a condemned building or pest infestation. It was bright red, made to shame. Neighbors walked their dogs a little faster past my lot that week. Some even crossed the street. I didn't remove the sign. I let it flap in the wind. 3 days later, during my weekly delivery to the local food pantry, I brought it with me. I leaned it against the crates of fresh vegetables. I was dropping off beans, onions, 3 dozen tomatoes, and bundles of herbs. The volunteers laughed. One woman took a photo. It ended up on social media. That same evening, Karen showed up at my place again. She didn't even knock, just stood in the driveway with 2 other board members behind her like backup singers. She had that same paper coffee cup, probably lukewarm and bitter like her smile. "Mr. Callahan," she began, "I'm here to address your ongoing refusal to adhere to Fair Hollow's aesthetic guidelines." "You mean growing food?" I asked, arms crossed. "Gardens are permitted within reason," she said, "but your setup exceeds the scope of personal landscaping." "It's not landscaping, it's survival," I said calmly. "We live in a community, Mr. Callahan. Your choices affect property values." I stared at her for a long second, letting that sink in. If your idea of value doesn't include access to food, maybe you're measuring the wrong things. Her jaw tightened. She stepped closer, clearly trying to assert some kind of power. "We filed a formal complaint with the county," she said. "Your property is being reassessed for zoning violations." That's when I smiled. Not a smirk, not a grin, just a small, quiet smile. "Karen," I said, lowering my voice, "you're standing on land classified as Zone RA since 1971. Rural agriculture. Your board may have bylaws, but they don't override county ordinances. I know this because I pulled the land records myself. Want a copy?" She blinked. The man behind her, some guy named Todd, who once complained to me that the HOA fined him for painting his garage door slightly off-white, shifted awkwardly. The third board member, Marcy, I think looked down at her tablet and mumbled something about confirming with legal. Karen didn't back down. She never did. "Well," she said, "I hope you're prepared for the consequences. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." "No," I said. "You are." They left without another word. A week passed. Then 2. No one returned. I thought maybe they'd moved on. Maybe they realized I wasn't bluffing and decided to focus their energy on some other crisis, like an off-color swing set or a rogue recycling bin. But I should have known better. One morning, I walked out to find a drone buzzing over my garden. At first, I thought it was just a hobbyist. Then I noticed the HOA logo stickered on its body. It hovered for a moment, then darted off toward the clubhouse. I filed a complaint with the county sheriff about surveillance, without consent. The deputy just shrugged and said, "That HOA again, I was being watched." A few nights later, I heard laughter in the distance. Not joyful laughter mocking. My neighbor's teenage son had taken it upon himself to create a TikTok video called The Doomsday Farmer of Fair Hollow. I found it when someone sent me the link. It showed aerial footage of my land, choppy and poorly edited set to ominous music. The comments were worse. Is he growing weed or end-of-days carrots, someone call the National Guard? He's building a bunker. Karen better call FEMA before he turns it into Jurassic Park. But not all of them mocked me. One woman username, @BePreparedMom, wrote, "If more people did what he's doing, we wouldn't be in line for powdered milk after every hurricane." Still, the ridicule stung. I didn't respond publicly. I never do. But I doubled the perimeter fencing and started rotating the crops more frequently. I began storing seeds in vacuum-sealed jars. I taught a free online class about home-scale food resilience using my setup as a visual aid. Over 900 people watched the live stream. Most of them weren't from my town. I could feel the temperature rising not just in the neighborhood, but everywhere. Summer was dragging on with drought warnings. A massive tropical storm was brewing off the coast. Supermarkets were already low on inventory. Supply chains strained. One local grocer had a sign posted, "Limit 2 cans per person on all vegetables." And still, the HOA pushed back more relentless with each week that passed. It wasn't just about appearances anymore. It was personal. My presence reminded them that their comfort was fragile, that their manicured lawns and uniform shutters weren't going to save them when the trucks stopped rolling in. One board meeting evening, I parked across the street from the clubhouse and just sat in my truck watching as neighbors filed in. Some looked over at me. Most didn't. I thought about walking in, speaking, showing them charts, data, crop yield graphs, emergency prep guidelines, even photos from the aid missions I led in Guatemala, Somalia, and rural Arkansas after the ice storm in '09, but I knew better. They weren't ready to hear it. They'd have to feel it first, and it wouldn't be long now. The truth is, I didn't start growing food because I thought the world would end. I started because I knew what it looked like when systems broke down. Not in theory, not from headlines, but with my own eyes, boots on the ground, hands pulling bodies from rubble, and mouths that hadn't had clean water in 3 days. My second deployment took me to a disaster relief zone just outside Port-au-Prince, after the earthquake flattened homes like dominoes and turned highways into scars. We weren't there to fight, we were there to fix. And I watched day after day how quickly desperation bloomed. Hospitals filled with injuries no one could treat. Parents fed their children sugar water because that's all they had. Aid trucks were hijacked. Distribution centers burned down. I saw how the civilized parts of people peeled away when hunger walked through the door. I carried those images home with me. Not as trauma, I'd made peace with the things I couldn't unsee, but as lessons. That's what prepping was to me. Not paranoia, not delusion, just preparation. Like buckling your seatbelt before the crash. After I left the service, I used my benefits to buy back this land from a cousin who wanted to sell it to a developer. I didn't have much else, not a family, not a pension fat enough to sit still on. But I had time, and I had will. So I started reading, studying. I dug through agronomy reports, USDA guides, permaculture blogs. I built raised beds with drainage systems modeled after techniques from Vietnam. I tested heirloom seed strains for yield and resistance. I read books on seed sovereignty and bartered with old farmers who taught me tricks you can't find on YouTube. I kept everything modest. No shipping containers, no camo netting or panic rooms. Just good food, good dirt, and systems that didn't rely on grid power. Still, people rolled their eyes. You expecting the apocalypse, they'd joke. No, I'd say. Just a storm or two. But storms come in more ways than one. By late August, the weather reports started changing. A tropical system stalled over the Gulf and began to strengthen. The spaghetti models varied, but most showed it crawling straight toward us. Local news started talking about backup water supplies and generators. Supermarkets got busy. Gas stations got lines. And I, for the first time since this HOA war began, felt the air shift, not just outside, but in the way people looked at me. Suddenly, the man who grew food didn't seem so crazy. I started getting quiet knocks on my door. First from Mitch the neighbor, who once whispered his support like a guilty confession. He asked sheepishly if I had any spare batteries. Then came Loretta, the older woman, 2 houses down, who never returned a wave. She'd seen me drying herbs on my back patio and asked if I knew anything about natural fever reducers. Her husband had a bad cough, and the pharmacy was out of expectorants. I gave her time, and Mullen told her how to steep them. Word spread. Fast. By the time the hurricane made landfall 70 miles south, I had a rotating line of neighbors asking me questions they wouldn't have dared speak aloud a month ago. What kind of seeds do you plant? How do you store water if the pressure fails? Do you think the stores will restock before the next rain? I answered them all, kindly, calmly. Because as much as I hated the way they'd treated me, I didn't hate them. Most people don't think ahead until they've been pushed to the brink, and brinkmanship was something I knew well. Then the power went out. The town's backup systems failed within hours. Cell towers flickered. One grocery store generator caught fire. FEMA trucks rolled in 3 days later, but by then, the food lines stretched down the block. Fuel was rationed. Shelters filled up. The mayor declared a state of emergency, and then, officially, FEMA did too. That's when the HOA started to panic. They tried to pretend everything was fine, sent out reassuring emails about water conservation and neighborhood safety patrols. But nobody cared about HOA patrols when their kids were eating cereal with powdered milk and the fridge smelled like a swamp. Karen called me. That was the first surprise. She left a voicemail that started with forced cheer. "Hi there, Mr. Callahan. We just wanted to reach out and check in, see how things are going on your end. We were wondering if you might be open to sharing some of your produce or supplies with the neighborhood in these difficult times. Perhaps we can set up a community table near the clubhouse." I stared at my phone for a long while after that. Not angry, just stunned. It took them losing access to everything to realize they'd destroyed the one thing that could have helped them most. My field. My field was gone. Because while I was busy reinforcing my root cellar the week before the storm, they'd sent a contractor under cover of HOA authority to bulldoze it. Said it was for community safety, that my greenhouse posed a structural hazard during high winds. They flattened it. All of it. The compost bins, the irrigation lines, the hand-built trellises. My sweet potato crop 2 weeks from harvest. My vertical kale towers. Even the beehive I'd nurtured from a wild colony. The storm hadn't destroyed my garden. They had. And now the president of the HOA, who signed that demolition order, was asking me to feed the people she tried to humiliate me in front of. Scout barked at the door. Someone else was knocking. Probably another neighbor looking for help. For medicine. For food that no longer existed. I didn't answer. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the old photos I'd tacked up on the wall. Haiti, Puerto Rico, a refugee camp in Nevada after the big fire. I'd held strangers' hands and shared rations in every one of those places. Because when people are desperate, you help. But this felt different, because the disaster didn't destroy my ability to help them. They did that themselves. 2 days after the storm passed, the sun rose over a neighborhood that no longer pretended to be pristine. The trim lawns of Fair Hollow were strewn with broken shutters, mangled patio furniture, and the occasional shattered solar lantern that had once lit walkways like suburban fairy dust. The facade had cracked, literally and metaphorically. Generators hummed like an insect swarm. Some neighbors grilled meat from their failing freezers out on the sidewalks, trying to salvage it before rot set in. Others waited in long, winding lines at the elementary school, where FEMA had set up a temporary distribution point. The smell of mildew and wet insulation hung in the air like a wet rag. And beneath it all, silence from the HOA. Until they showed up at my door again. It was Karen, of course. This time, she wasn't flanked by her usual entourage of board members, but by someone new. A man in a powder blue polo with a clipboard and a thin, unreadable smile. "Mr. Callahan," Karen said, voice unusually soft. "We need to talk." I didn't step aside. I let them stand on the front porch while Scout eyed them from behind the screen door, tail rigid, ears forward. The man stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Aaron Whitaker, Property Compliance Advisor. I've been contracted to assist the Fair Hollow HOA in coordinating post-storm safety and neighborhood infrastructure restoration." I didn't shake his hand. "I'm not part of Fair Hollow," I said plainly. He smiled like I hadn't spoken. "We understand that your property falls in a bit of a gray zone, but due to its visibility and proximity, the board has determined it falls under our extended environmental jurisdiction." That phrase, extended environmental jurisdiction, made my stomach tighten. Karen cleared her throat. "We're trying to move forward, Mr. Callahan. The board understands that tensions have risen in recent weeks. Perhaps we can start over. Extend an olive branch, if you will." She gestured to the lot behind my house, the empty, dirt-scarred, bulldozed patch where my food system used to thrive. I stepped outside and shut the door behind me. "You want to start over?" I said. "After flattening everything I built, after violating county land protections, and destroying a designated agricultural plot in the middle of the worst supply chain crisis in 10 years. Karen pressed her lips together. "We were misinformed. We believed the structures posed a danger in high wind events. We acted in the interest of safety." "Did you consult the zoning board?" I asked. "File a hazard report? Request an inspection from the county? Or did you just sign a paper and send in a guy with a bulldozer while I was gone?" Neither of them answered. I looked at Aaron. "Do you know what that greenhouse produced in the last 6 months?" "I believe Ms. Whitley said it was mainly decorative," he replied, cautious. "Decorative?" I barked, a short laugh. "You think 10 pounds of okra a week is for show? You think heirloom tomatoes and medicinal herbs don't feed people? You think I grew 300 pounds of sweet potatoes for aesthetic harmony?" Aaron shifted. His grip on the clipboard tightened. Karen stepped in again. "Look, we understand you're angry. But the truth is we all need to pull together now. Your experience, your background, it could really help this community recover. We're prepared to forgive previous non-compliance if you're willing to work with us." I stared at her. Cold. Unmoving. "What exactly are you asking?" She smiled again. Too rehearsed, too smooth. "We'd like your help restarting a shared garden. On HOA-approved land. The clubhouse lawn, perhaps. You could oversee it. We'll compensate you, of course." Modestly. "Think of it as healing." Healing. That was the word she chose. I stepped down the porch stairs and walked past them without a word. I crossed my yard past the dented rain barrels, the crushed compost bins, the shards of my old greenhouse glinting beneath clumps of uprooted carrots. I stood in the middle of it all and faced them. "This land," I said, "is the only place in this whole neighborhood that could have fed people when the trucks stopped. And you destroyed it for being unsightly." Karen opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. "No, you don't get to spin this. You saw something that didn't fit your design manual, and instead of asking questions, you sent a machine to tear it down. You didn't just kill plants. You killed months of preparation, years of knowledge. You killed trust." She looked away. I stepped closer. "If people go hungry in this neighborhood over the next few weeks, and they will know that it won't be because of the storm, it'll be because of you." Karen's face tightened, but she didn't respond. Aaron looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I'm not rebuilding this garden for your HOA," I said flatly. "And I'm not salvaging your reputation. I'm documenting everything. Every notice, every voicemail, every satellite photo. I have timestamps, witnesses, permits, county assessments. I know people at FEMA. I've already started a file." Karen's eyes flicked toward her car like she wanted to leave. "But more than that, I said I want you to understand something. You don't get to weaponize shame and then beg for mercy when the tides turn. You buried your own lifeline." Neither of them spoke as I turned my back on them and walked into what remained of my shed. Scout followed me tail low. I crouched and pulled out a weatherproof container tucked under a false floorboard. Inside were vacuum-sealed bags of seeds, a second set of garden plans, a copy of my original agricultural exemption certificate, and 3 thumb drives of documentation. I had prepared for this. Not exactly this, no, but something like it. Because storms don't just come from the sky. Sometimes they wear name tags and pass bylaws and smile while they cut your legs out from under you. But I wasn't finished, and I wasn't alone. That night, I got a knock on the door. It was Mitch, the whispering neighbor. This time he brought his teenage daughter and a box of salvaged wood. "Whatever you're doing," he said, "I want in. My kid wants to learn. You teach, we'll build." He looked over at the ruins of my field. "You can't grow on their land," he said, "so maybe we start using ours." And just like that, the tide shifted. Not because the HOA changed, but because the people around it finally did. The night before it happened, I was sitting on my back porch under a sky that had finally cleared of clouds. The stars looked sharp and brittle, like you could snap them right off the black velvet of the sky. Scout lay curled at my feet, and the air was thick with that post-storm hush, the kind that makes you think the earth is holding its breath. The garden smelled like memory. Even though most of it was gone, the turned soil and crushed stems still carried that life scent, stubborn and haunting. I hadn't gone out to the field since Karen and Aaron's little visit. It felt like mourning ground. I kept catching myself mentally watering beds that no longer existed, reaching for tools that had been buried under debris. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I drifted in and out, head full of aching thoughts. Just before dawn, Scout started growling low in his throat. I sat up, instantly alert. Years of service had hardwired my instincts. Certain sounds sliced through sleep no matter how deep. It was the distant rumble of heavy machinery. I threw on jeans and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. The noise grew louder. Not the sluggish grind of a delivery truck or emergency response vehicle. No, this was sharper, harsher. I rounded the side of the house and froze. A bulldozer was rolling down my street. Behind it, 2 flatbed trucks. On them were massive industrial dumpsters and what looked like earth-moving equipment. They turned onto the service road that bordered the far edge of my lot, the edge closest to Fair Hollow's manicured clubhouse. I felt my fists clench without thinking. Scout barked once, short and furious. I ran back inside and grabbed my phone. No notifications, no alerts. I dialed the county code enforcement office. Nothing. It was barely 6:15 a.m. I sprinted across the backyard and ducked behind the old hedge line as the first machine lowered its blade. They weren't just here to clean up storm damage. They were here for me. Men in reflective vests moved like they'd done this 100 times before, cordoning off the area, consulting clipboards, marking the ground with fluorescent orange spray. One of them rolled out hazard signs that read, "Unsafe structure debris removal authorized." But there was no debris here. This was deliberate, targeted. I stormed up to the nearest worker. "Who authorized this?" He barely looked at me, talked to the site lead. I found the lead, a tall guy in his 50s with sun-baked skin and a walkie clipped to his vest. I stepped right in front of him. "This is my land," I said. "You're trespassing." He didn't blink. "We have a work order." "From who? Fair Hollow Community Board." I laughed. "Cold? Short? They don't have jurisdiction here." He shrugged. "Doesn't say that on the order." I shoved my phone toward him, pulling up the scanned copy of my zoning exemption. He glanced at it but didn't stop the crew. The bulldozer was already inching forward, blade humming as it rolled toward the wrecked remains of my greenhouse. "You need to stop," I said, stepping in front of the machine. But he waved me off. "Sir, you need to step back for your safety." "My safety," I barked. "You're stealing the only source of food in this area that isn't dependent on a broken supply chain." By now, the machine operator had cut the engine. The lead walked to his truck, pulled out a folder, and handed me a paper. It was the HOA's demolition authorization. It cited post-storm cleanup provisions. Stamped, signed, not by the county, by Karen. Karen had forged an emergency claim, and she had filed it under an ambiguous clause in the HOA's disaster response guidelines, one I hadn't even known existed. The bulldozer started again. I stood helplessly as they tore through what was left, scooping up soil that had been carefully layered with compost worm castings, mulch. It was just dirt to them, trash. They tossed twisted bits of trellis and irrigation line into the dumpsters like junk. My workbench, my rain barrel filter, the bench my dad built when I was 12, gone. I tried calling the sheriff, busy lines. I tried calling the mayor's office, no response. I tried standing in front of the machines again, but the lead just threatened to have me removed for interfering with emergency operations. That was the moment I realized what kind of war I was in. Not the kind with guns and uniforms, but the kind where bureaucracy is the blade, and plausible deniability is the shield. They could call it a cleanup. They could call it safety. But I knew what it was, erasure. It took less than 2 hours. 2 hours to undo 2 years of work. When they finally rolled out, leaving tire tracks in my dead field, the quiet was deafening. Scout whimpered as he sniffed the barren earth. I dropped to my knees in the mud and ran my fingers through it. Still warm, still damp, but hollow, like the heart had been ripped out. Then came the worst part. Karen arrived. She didn't knock this time, just walked onto my property like she'd earned it. Her boots crunched over broken clay pots and snapped tomato cages. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "You knew it was protected land," I whispered. She tilted her head. "We believed it posed a risk. Better safe than sorry. You bulldozed food," I said, "in the middle of a supply crisis." She blinked. "It was never approved, because it didn't need to be." She sighed. "Well, at least now we can move forward. Clean slate." I stood up, took one step closer. "I want you off my land," I said. She hesitated. "You'll hear from my attorney." She smirked. "Oh, we're way past that. This was an emergency action. Good luck getting traction." I didn't say another word. She left. But this time, I didn't feel defeated. I felt something else sharp, clean, and cutting through the fog of anger, clarity. They'd gone too far, and I had everything I needed to prove it. They thought they buried me. What they didn't know was I was a seed. The wind came back 3 days later, not as a whisper, not as a warning, but as a wall. It rose from the south like a clenched fist, dragging blackened clouds that swallowed the sun by mid-morning. No one expected a second round so soon. The first storm had already strained nerves and stripped away illusions of suburban comfort. This one arrived like a reckoning. Local news called it a rapid intensification event, a term I'd heard before in disaster zones. By the time the governor's office issued a statewide alert, most stores were already stripped bare from the first wave. Gas was gone. Batteries gone. Water people were boiling it in bathtubs and scraping rust from old rain collectors. I watched it all unfold from my kitchen window, arms crossed over my chest, as the first gusts tossed pine needles across the driveway. Scout lay by the door, tense but silent. He knew the drill. We'd been through worse, but never this close to home. The HOA sent out one last desperate newsletter begging residents to conserve resources and adhere to community cooperation standards. They promised that the board had a plan. But I'd seen their plan. It had been a bulldozer. Power flickered by noon, then died completely by nightfall. And that's when it happened, what FEMA would later describe as a critical infrastructure collapse compounded by mismanagement at the local level. What we in the neighborhood simply called the blackout week. First, the water lines, Yuan-Yin system lines, backed up. Something about a valve failure at the treatment plant, either from pressure loss or damage from the storm. Toilets stopped flushing. Faucets hissed with air. The bottled water supply at the fire station ran out within 6 hours. People started posting desperate messages in neighborhood group chats, asking if anyone had extra to share. Then came the food crisis. Fair Hollow had always prided itself on proximity to upscale grocers and farm-fresh delivery options, but none of those mattered now. The delivery trucks weren't coming. The roads out of town were blocked by downed trees and sinkholes. Even FEMA convoys couldn't get through. I stood outside my property line on the second day, watching neighbors pace nervously along the sidewalk. Children with empty bowls sat beside powerless refrigerators, while their parents stood in line at the one open church, handing out dry lentils and peanut butter in measured spoonfuls. That night, a 911 dispatcher leaked a FEMA memo. Someone posted it online. I saved a screenshot. Regional resource distribution, severely hampered by suburban HOA interference. Sites with previously reported community gardens or independent food systems compromised. Alternative supply hubs under emergency reassessment. I stared at the sentence for hours. They were talking about me. And the garden they destroyed. Fair Hollow wasn't just another unprepared suburb. It was a liability because they'd bulldozed their own backup plan. Word spread fast. By the third night, Karen knocked on my door again. This time, she didn't come dressed like royalty. Her makeup was gone, her windbreaker damp with sweat. She looked smaller somehow, frayed, like someone whose reality had been unmade in the dark. "We need help," she said softly. I stood in the doorway, silent. "There are families with babies," she continued, "elderly people who haven't eaten since yesterday. We know you used to have food stored, seeds, supplies, please." Behind her, I saw flashlights bobbing through the darkness. Neighbors moved like shadows, some clutching buckets, others plastic bags. They weren't hostile. They were hungry. I said nothing. Karen pressed on. "You can hate me. I deserve that. But don't let people suffer because of me." Her voice cracked, not theatrical, genuine. And I wanted to believe her. I really did. But I also remembered the precision with which they signed the demolition order, the speed with which they erased everything I'd built, the smug certainty that their system would always provide. They hadn't just ignored my warnings, they'd mocked them. And now they came to my door hollow-eyed and hollow-bellied, asking for the thing they buried. I took a long breath, then stepped outside. "I don't have enough to feed everyone," I said. "The crops are gone. The root cellar's been looted, probably by the cleanup crew. But I do have this." I held up a laminated packet. Inside it, maps, planting plans, seed rotation charts, instructions for water purification and composting. Karen stared at it like I'd handed her a foreign language. "It's not a meal," I said. "It's how to survive the next one." She took it, slowly, carefully. "Tell your board," I added, "I'm contacting the mayor's office in the morning. And FEMA. I have every document, every photo, every timestamp. They destroyed protected land, violated zoning law, interfered with disaster mitigation. They're going to answer for it." Karen didn't argue, didn't protest, just nodded. I watched her walk away into the dark, cradling that packet like it was gold. That night, I sat by lantern light and drafted my statement. I attached photo satellite shots of the bulldozer-signed demolition orders, the exemption certificate, the community emails, even the garden harvest logs I'd kept for my own records. I outlined every instance where the HOA obstructed or sabotaged food resilience efforts. I CC'd not just FEMA, but the county commissioner, the local paper, and the Department of Emergency Preparedness. I hit send at 3:02 a.m. By morning, my phone was flooded. The FEMA liaison called first, then a journalist from the regional news, then the mayor's aide. By noon, a camera crew stood at the edge of my destroyed garden, filming me as I walked them through what had been and what could have saved them all. That afternoon, a FEMA official confirmed what I already suspected: Fair Hollow was now classified as a compromised zone, meaning no priority aid, no supply bypass, no emergency distribution until internal matters were resolved, meaning the HOA had cut themselves off from help. The video interview aired that night. By morning, it had over 300,000 views. Neighbors knocked on my door in ones and twos. Some brought old seeds. Others brought wood, scrap metal, even torn bags of fertilizer they'd once mocked me for storing. They didn't ask for food anymore. They asked to learn. And so among the ruins, we began again. Not for them, not even for me, but for what had been lost and what we refused to lose again. The morning after the news segment aired, I stepped outside to a front lawn, littered with newspaper clippings and handwritten notes shoved beneath stones or taped to the mailbox. Most of them weren't signed. Some just said, "Thank you." Others were longer apologies scrawled in hurried penmanship, desperate acknowledgments of guilt disguised as gratitude. A boy no older than 10 left a Tupperware of muffins at my gate. A note read, "My mom said we laughed at you and she's sorry. I think your garden was cool. It nearly broke me. but not as much as what happened that afternoon. Karen returned again, this time with 2 HOA board members and a man wearing a navy blazer, his clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. I watched them from my porch as they gathered in a huddle by my gate, visibly unsure if they should even knock. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just 2 months ago, Karen marched up this path like she owned it. Now she stood hesitant like a child caught breaking the very window she once called ugly. I let them wait. Eventually, Karen approached alone. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. She didn't have her usual coffee cup or the condescending tilt of her chin. Her eyes were swollen and puffy. She didn't look powerful. She looked human in that fragile, skin-thin way people only look when their illusions have cracked open like a dropped egg. "May I speak with you?" she asked. I nodded, but didn't invite her inside. We stood on the porch steps a few feet apart. Scout sat between us, ever watchful. She began slowly. "Mr. Callahan, I want to say something, not as president of the HOA, just as a neighbor." I waited. She swallowed hard. "We were wrong. I was wrong." She looked down, then back up. "I saw your garden as a nuisance, a challenge to order, to everything we thought a community should look like. I thought we were protecting our neighborhood, but really, we were protecting an illusion, one that couldn't hold up when things actually went wrong." I didn't speak. "I understand now what you were trying to do. I see how much you gave, and how much we destroyed." Her voice cracked at that word destroyed. Behind her, the other 2 board members shifted uncomfortably. They were trying to keep up appearances, standing like sentinels in cardigans and khakis, as if the storm hadn't humbled them, along with everything else. Karen took a breath. "I'm resigning." That got my attention. "I can't speak for the rest of the board, but I can't continue leading a community I failed to protect." It wasn't melodramatic. There was no teary grandstanding, just a woman standing in the wreckage of her choices, finally realizing the damage they'd caused. I looked at her for a long time, then finally asked, "Why now?" She didn't hesitate. "Because I saw the footage. Not just the FEMA coverage, the video your neighbor Mitch uploaded. The one showing the garden, the volunteers, the food you gave away long before the storm ever came." Her voice grew quieter. "I saw what you built, and I saw what we took from you." Silence. Then almost in a whisper, she added, "I also saw how people listened to you. Not because you demanded it, but because you prepared when no one else did." I studied her face. The cracks in her composure weren't for show. It didn't erase the past. Nothing could. But there was something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Pity, maybe. But more than that, I felt release. The rage that had curled inside my chest for weeks began to loosen. "Do you know what the worst part was?" I said finally. She looked up. "It wasn't that you bulldozed my garden. It was that you did it after I warned you. You knew what I was trying to build, and you saw it as defiance instead of stewardship." Karen nodded, her throat tight. "I'm not interested in your forgiveness," she said softly. But I had to say it. "I'm sorry." I nodded once, slowly. Then I handed her a folder. It contained copies of the very same survival guides I'd given FEMA. It also included detailed plans for rebuilding the garden as a community co-op, not under HOA jurisdiction, but through the city's new Emergency Resilience Grant, which I had helped push through thanks to that same interview. "Give this to whoever replaces you," I said, "and tell them it's their last chance to get it right." Karen took the folder like it was heavier than it looked. She didn't say another word, just turned and walked away, her shoulders hunched, not in shame, but in acceptance. I watched her disappear down the path she'd once ruled like a queen, and then I turned back to the land. It wasn't much yet, just dark earth and stakes marking out new rows, but the volunteers were already trickling in. Mitch arrived with plywood and a socket set. Loretta brought buckets of compost she'd started after watching one of my live streams. Teenagers showed up with wheelbarrows. Some of them had mocked me weeks ago. Now they carried sacks of mulch and offered quiet apologies through their actions. And just like that, the garden began to return. Not as mine, but as ours. We called it the Victory Patch, A nod to the past those wartime gardens planted in desperation. But this time it wasn't born of war. It was born of realization. And for the first time since the bulldozers came, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: hope. It was a clear morning when the news crew came. Not just the local channel that usually covered ribbon cuttings and bake sales, but a regional affiliate of one of the national networks. A woman named Helena Price stood in front of the battered community garden with her cameraman eyes sharp and blazer crisp, her voice perfectly modulated for tragedy. We stood among the half-rebuilt beds. Behind her, you could still see the scar's uneven earth, where rows of beans and corn used to thrive, the torn fencing waiting to be replaced, and just beyond that, the empty clubhouse with its silent flagpole and shuttered windows. Fair Hollow looked like a metaphor made real. She walked toward me with a practiced grace microphone in hand. "Mr. Callahan, thank you for agreeing to this." I didn't shake her hand. Not to be rude, I just didn't want to be part of a performance. Not again. "I'm not doing this to be a headline," I said. She nodded. "We understand. But what happened here, it's not just local anymore. People are watching." I led her and her team to a shaded part of the lot, where we'd set up a folding table and 2 mismatched chairs. It looked humble, and that was fine. The truth didn't need a stage. The interview began with the usual questions: what made me start the garden, what led to the tension with the HOA, how I felt watching my work be destroyed. I answered simply, plainly. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The footage of the bulldozer already did that for me. I gave them the receipts, photographs of the field, before and after video of Karen at my doorstep, the signed demolition order that bore no legal authority, the zoning documents, the FEMA classification memo, and the list of donations I'd made to the food pantry before the garden was lost. They filmed as I walked the edge of what used to be the sweet potato rows, now bare but remarked with chalk lines for replanting. They got a shot of Scout sitting loyally at the corner of the plot, the silent guardian of everything we were trying to rebuild. Then Helena asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What do you want people to take from this, Mr. Callahan?" I didn't have to think. That we confuse comfort with preparedness. That we design communities to look safe instead of be safe. And when someone breaks the illusion, we'd rather silence them than listen. She said nothing for a beat. I continued, voice steady. What happened here wasn't just about one man's garden. It was about what we value. We say community means neighbors looking out for each other, but when the system wobbled, everyone realized they'd handed over their autonomy in exchange for uniform mailboxes and lawn height restrictions. And now, she asked, now they're hungry, and they're learning. That soundbite, I'd later learn, would be played on repeat across every major station by nightfall. After the interview, the mayor called. He didn't waste time. "Callahan," he said, "I want to formally apologize on behalf of the city." I didn't know the extent of what they'd done until I saw the broadcast. I could hear his breath catch like he was weighing his next words. "I also want you to know we're launching an investigation into the HOA board's actions, zoning violations, unauthorized demolition, obstruction of resilience infrastructure. It won't be fast, but it'll be real." I thanked him, told him I didn't want retribution, but I did want change. He asked if I'd consider serving on the new Municipal Resilience Advisory Committee. I said yes. A day later, the City Council voted to remove Fair Hollow's HOA from its position of legal enforcement. They would remain in name only as a voluntary association. By week's end, 5 other neighborhoods filed similar complaints about their own HOAs. A pattern was emerging, one that showed how often community autonomy had been sacrificed for the illusion of order. But not everyone was angry. Hundreds of people, strangers, started sending packages, seeds, tools, handwritten letters. A retired teacher from Kansas mailed me heirloom okra seeds with a note, "My grandfather grew these during the Dust Bowl. Yours will too." A woman from Oregon sent books on medicinal plants, her family's own resilience handbook, and a jar of home-dried sage. A city in upstate New York voted to fund 10 neighborhood gardens after watching the story on their local affiliate. Something was moving. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming what we'd forgotten that resilience doesn't come from rules or roles, it comes from roots. Deep ones. I began teaching workshops twice a week in the empty clubhouse, now free of HOA control. Teenagers came with notebooks, veterans showed up with stories, mothers with children, retired engineers, all learning how to grow, preserve, store, and share. Mitch helped install a solar panel array for backup power. Loretta took over organizing volunteers. The clubhouse lawn was now a compost hub, its pristine turf finally useful. As for Karen, she disappeared quietly. I heard she moved away. No one threw stones, no one celebrated. We had bigger things to do. One afternoon, Helena called again. They want to run a follow-up, national, primetime. I told her maybe. But right now, we were planting cucumbers. The sun was out, and the soil was ready. The first subpoena landed on a Monday morning. I knew it was coming. After the news segment went national, everything moved fast. Lawyers got involved. County regulators started returning calls they'd ignored for years. The footage of my bulldozed garden, especially the before and after satellite overlays I had submitted, wasn't just a local scandal anymore. It was Exhibit A in what would become a sprawling investigation into HOA overreach. The subpoena wasn't for me. It was for the HOA board. I stood at my mailbox, thumbing through the envelope's thick packet of documents as the mail carrier nodded with a faint smirk. "Been delivering a lot of these lately," he said. "Looks like someone finally lit a fire." He wasn't wrong. Within a week, the entire Fair Hollow board had been summoned to a county hearing. The charges ranged from zoning interference and destruction of registered agricultural use land to fraudulent misuse of emergency authority. At first, they tried to deflect, claiming confusion, acting like the demolition was a miscommunication during the storm. But documents don't lie. My carefully archived evidence, the emails, voicemails, video footage, timestamps, cut through their excuses, like a scalpel. The hearing was open to the public. I didn't want to go. I didn't need revenge. I already had something better vindication. But I went anyway because too many people were now watching. Not just from Fair Hollow, but from neighboring communities, from counties, from out of state. I arrived early, sat in the back, Scout stayed home. The room was buzzing, a strange mixture of anticipation and shame. People who used to cross the street to avoid me now nodded solemnly as I walked past. Some looked down. Others whispered apologies I didn't need. When the HOA board entered, Karen wasn't with them. She'd officially resigned and vanished from town shortly after the news broke. No one knew where she'd gone. Her seat at the table remained empty, a small plaque in front of it that said, "President," in gold letters. It felt like a joke. The others, Todd Marcy, and two lesser-known members sat stiffly in their matching suits flanked by counsel. Their expressions ranged from grim to hollow. This wasn't a bake sale dispute anymore. The county commissioner opened with a statement, "This hearing will determine whether the Fair Hollow Homeowners Association acted within legal authority when it authorized the demolition of private agricultural infrastructure during a declared state of emergency." I took a deep breath. The testimonies began. The city zoning director confirmed that my property was registered under rural agricultural zoning since the 1970s and had never been reclassified. A FEMA representative explained how Fair Hollow had been downgraded in the emergency relief map due to internal mismanagement. The city attorney presented documents proving the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land and had filed forged permits using emergency clauses intended for hazardous debris, not edible gardens. Then came my turn. They called me to the front and I walked slowly, deliberately. My boots echoed against the tile. I spoke clearly, not with anger, but with clarity. I am a retired service member. I've served on humanitarian missions across 4 continents. I've seen communities collapse in a matter of days. That's why I built my garden. Not to rebel, not to show off, but because I knew it might save lives when systems failed. I paused, let the silence settle. The HOA didn't just bulldoze food. They bulldozed preparation. They destroyed the only functioning, self-sufficient source of nutrition within walking distance of dozens of homes just days before a second storm knocked out power, water, and access to supply lines. I held up the photo of a child at the food line hollow-eyed, clutching a sandwich made from pantry donations. They called my garden unsightly. Then they begged me for what it used to provide. The room was dead quiet. When I finished, I returned to my seat without looking back. The hearing ended with a recommendation to dissolve the Fair Hollow HOA's enforcement authority entirely. The county would place the neighborhood under municipal oversight until a new elected and regulated board could be formed with real transparency, term limits, and a strict prohibition against land actions outside their domain. It was a win. But not just for me. Other communities began reaching out. A woman from Tennessee emailed me with a similar story. Her HOA had fined her for planting fruit trees, then tried to claim ownership of her harvest during a drought. A retired firefighter in Arizona sent photos of his native herb garden torn up under the pretext of fire risk. The stories kept coming. Soon a group of us formed an online coalition, Sovereign Sprouts. It started small, just a place to share advice templates, legal resources. But within 2 months, we had over 10,000 members. City planners, retired farmers, teachers, veterans, young families, people who were tired of being punished for trying to feed themselves. We began lobbying for state-level protections, the Food Resilience Freedom Act. It proposed legal safeguards for small-scale, non-commercial agriculture within residential zones regardless of HOA regulation. By year's end, we had 3 state senators co-sponsoring it. And through it all, the garden grew again. This time, it wasn't just mine. Each bed was adopted by a different neighbor. Mitch built a rainwater harvesting system that fed drip lines across the whole lot. Loretta ran compost workshops from the old clubhouse. Teenagers maintained the bee boxes. Every weekend, we met for seed swaps and soil testing and quiet conversations about the things we used to take for granted. One Saturday, I stood in the middle of the garden and looked around. The kale was thick and sturdy again. The tomatoes glowed red like lanterns, and the air was filled with the scent of basil and pine mulch. A girl no older than 12 stood beside her mother, holding up a potted cucumber sprout with both hands. "This one's mine," she said proudly. I crouched beside her. "That's a good one." She looked up at me. "My mom says you saved us." I shook my head. "No, sweetheart. You all saved yourselves. I just planted the first seed. And maybe..." That was all it took. It took nearly a year for the scars to fade. Not the physical ones, the ruts from the bulldozer, were still there subtly beneath the soft rise of new grass and mulch. But the deeper ones, the betrayals, the ridicule, the hollow silences of neighbors who once scoffed at me, those began to fade with each season like frost receding from a pane of glass. By spring, the garden had returned in full force. Not as a copy of what it once was, but something greater, something layered. We added trellises made from salvaged fence wood, raised beds crafted from old pallets. A hand-painted sign at the gate read, "Community roots grown by everyone." We didn't ask the HOA's permission, because the HOA as it had existed no longer had the power to grant or deny it. The city officially integrated the lot into a resilience zone, a new designation formed in direct response to the incident. It provided grant funding, legal protection, and zoning immunity for community agriculture projects. Ours was the first. Others soon followed. Fair Hollow changed, slowly but meaningfully. The clubhouse no longer held board meetings about mailbox paint shades or whether flags were too political. Instead, it hosted seed banks, cooking workshops, and solar water purification demos. Loretta, at 68, became an unlikely icon, leading Saturday canning circles and managing a barter wall where neighbors exchanged preserved foods, repair services, and seedlings. Even the children changed. Once hidden behind video screens and structured playdates, they now spent afternoons chasing butterflies between rows of beans, learning to identify herbs by scent, and watching bees move in synchronized dance. They didn't call me Crazy Farmer anymore. They called me Mr. Joe, or sometimes just Sir. There was a day in late summer, hot, bright, the kind of day that makes tomatoes explode with color, when I stood on the edge of the garden and just listened. To the wind moving through corn stalks, to laughter, to life. It wasn't perfect. There were still problems, occasional bickering over water schedules or compost smells. But they were real problems rooted in effort, not control, and that made all the difference. I no longer feared Karen's return. Her name still came up now and then, like a fable, a warning tale. But there was no longer venom behind it, just understanding. That power, when unearned, collapses under the weight of consequence. One afternoon, I received a letter, not from her, from a city official in a small town across the state. They'd watched our story unfold and wanted help drafting their own resilience zone ordinance. I agreed. And so began the next chapter. I traveled, spoke at town halls, testified at policy hearings, helped military veterans set up permaculture systems on unused land behind schools. I gave a TEDx talk titled "The Garden They Destroyed Became the Blueprint We Needed." It went viral. Sovereign Sprouts, our once humble online coalition, became a registered nonprofit. We partnered with local governments, trained volunteers, built mobile education kits. Every workshop ended with the same phrase: prepare quietly, grow publicly, heal collectively. But always, I came home. Because here where it started is where I felt most grounded. I rebuilt the greenhouse, this time with insulated panels and a solar venting system. It housed seedlings for half the neighborhood, including some rare strains sent from seed libraries across the country. One, a strain of Cherokee purple tomato, had been preserved by a family in Appalachia for 5 generations. They said they trusted me with it. And I didn't take that lightly. Scout aged gracefully alongside me. His muzzle turned silver, his steps slower, but he still followed me to the rows every morning, still barked at squirrels with indignation. He had earned his place as the garden's honorary guardian. Children brought him scraps of jerky and called him General Scout. The irony wasn't lost on me. One Sunday while harvesting squash, a boy named Eli, Mitch's youngest, asked me, "Do you miss the way it used to be?" Before all this, I paused, wiping sweat from my brow. No, I said, I miss the peace I thought I had, but not the ignorance it came with. He didn't fully understand, but one day he would. Later that week, the mayor invited me to help draft an emergency preparedness guide for the entire county. I accepted on one condition, that the section on food security begin with a story. My story. Not to glorify what happened, but to remind people that one garden quietly grown can change everything when the wind shifts. The closing lines of that guide would read, "Don't wait for permission to do what's right. Because when disaster comes, the soil won't ask which rules you followed. It will only ask what you planted. And in that truth, there is justice. And in that justice, healing. And in that healing, we grow again, not alone, but together."